Mark Williams' mornings always began in the same way. At precisely 5 a.m., the blaring sound of his old alarm clock jolted him awake, dragging him from the shallow, restless sleep that had become all too familiar. His small, worn-down apartment on the outskirts of the city bore the marks of his modest life. Faded wallpaper, a leaky faucet in the kitchen, and a creaky bed frame that groaned each time he moved. Despite its flaws, it was home, a sanctuary he could barely afford but fiercely protected. Mark was a janitor at the city courthouse, a job he'd held for nearly 15 years. It wasn't glamorous, nor did it offer much in the way of financial security, but it was steady work. The courthouse, with its pristine marble floors and towering columns, stood in stark contrast to the life Mark led. Every morning, as he entered its imposing halls, he felt the weight of his insignificance. To the judges, lawyers, and clerks bustling through its corridors, he was invisible, just another cog in the machine, there to clean up their messes and ensure their world ran smoothly. Mark had long grown accustomed to the way people looked at him. The sidelong glances, the subtle sneers, the way they avoided eye contact, as if acknowledging his existence might somehow sully their own. He knew what they were thinking. Just a janitor. Just another black man with a mop. The judgments were silent but deafening, and over time, Mark had learned to let them roll off his back. He had no choice. Dwelling on the unfairness of it all wouldn't pay the bills. But if there was one person who made his daily grind unbearable, it was Judge Karen Blake. A woman of sharp wit and sharper tongue, Judge Blake was a prominent figure in the courthouse. Her reputation for issuing decisive rulings and commanding a courtroom was matched only by her reputation for being cold and unrelenting. To the world, she was a paragon of justice and order. To Mark, she was a daily reminder of his place in the hierarchy. Every day, like clockwork, Mark would wheel his janitor's cart to her office. And every day, he'd find it in disarray. Papers scattered across the floor, coffee cups left to stain the polished wood of her desk, wrappers crumpled and tossed carelessly onto chairs. It was as if she made a deliberate effort to create chaos. As soon as she heard the squeak of his cart in the hallway, she'd smirk, her lips curling into a thin, cruel line. "Make sure it's spotless, Williams," she'd say, her voice dripping with condescension. "You wouldn't want me to report you for subpar work, now would you?" Mark would nod, forcing a polite smile that never reached his eyes. Inside, his jaw clenched, his pride stinging from the sting of her words. But he said nothing. He couldn't afford to lose this job. Not with rent overdue and utilities threatening to be cut off. Not when this job was a thin thread keeping him from falling into the abyss of poverty. As Judge Blake's heels clicked away down the hallway, Mark would get to work. His hands moved on autopilot, scrubbing and polishing until the room was immaculate. Despite the indignities, he took pride in his work. He didn't see himself as just a janitor. He saw himself as a man doing an honest day's labor. But no amount of pride could dull the sting of being treated as less than human. The other staff weren't much better. The clerks barely acknowledged his presence. The lawyers, dressed in their expensive suits, brushed past him as though he were part of the furniture. Even the younger janitors, fresh to the job and full of optimism, avoided him. They whispered among themselves about Mark's quiet demeanor and distant gaze. He was a man who had learned to endure, but at a cost. Despite everything, Mark had his moments of solace. He found joy in small things. The quiet hours after the courthouse emptied, when the halls were silent and he could work in peace. The way the polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights after a thorough cleaning. The rare smiles from kind strangers who recognized his humanity. These moments were fleeting but precious, reminders that there was still good in the world. One evening, after an especially grueling day, Mark lingered a moment longer in Judge Blake's office. He surveyed the room, taking in the stark contrast between her pristine desk and the chaotic pile of discarded papers he had just organized. For a brief second, anger flared in his chest. He thought about the years he had spent cleaning up after people like her, people who saw him as nothing more than a means to an end. But just as quickly as the anger came, it dissipated, replaced by a familiar resignation. Pushing his cart down the dimly lit hallway, Mark sighed, his footsteps echoing off the marble walls. The courthouse was empty now, the hustle and bustle of the day replaced by an eerie stillness. As he exited the building, the cool night air hit his face, bringing a momentary sense of relief. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself and began the long walk home. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional car speeding by and the faint hum of distant traffic. Mark kept his head down, his mind replaying the events of the day. Judge Blake's mocking tone, the silent indifference of the courthouse staff, the endless cycle of work and humiliation. It all weighed on him like a heavy coat he couldn't shrug off. As he turned onto a narrow side street, Mark's thoughts drifted to the past. He remembered his father, a man who had worked his entire life in the steel mills, his hands calloused from years of labor. Dignity isn't about what you do, his father used to say. It's about how you do it. Work hard, stay honest, and never let them break you. Mark had lived by those words, even when the world seemed determined to test his resolve. By the time he reached his apartment, exhaustion had seeped into his bones. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar creak of the floorboards and the faint smell of mildew. Tossing his keys onto the kitchen counter, he sank into the worn-out armchair in the corner of the room. The weight of the day pressed down on him, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the bitterness he usually kept at bay. Is this all there is? He wondered. Is this what my life amounts to? But even as the thought crossed his mind, he shook it off. Self-pity wouldn't change anything. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another day of work, another day of enduring, another day of survival. Mark's eyes grew heavy as he sat in the chair, his body too tired to move. Outside, the city hummed softly, the distant lights casting a faint glow through the thin curtains of his window. Unbeknownst to him, the events of the coming days would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. For Mark Williams, life was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would test his courage, his resolve, and his belief in justice. Underscore, 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 underscore. Mark's story had only just begun, but already it was clear that he was no ordinary man. Beneath the quiet exterior lay a strength forged by years of hardship, a strength that would soon be called upon in ways he could never have imagined. The night air was cool, a gentle breeze brushing against Mark Williams' face as he trudged home. His legs felt like lead, the exhaustion of another long day weighing him down. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional flicker of neon signs were the only signs of life in the quiet streets. Lost in thought, Mark almost didn't notice the faint glow ahead, a strange orange hue that danced like a flickering flame. As he turned the corner, his breath caught in his throat. In the middle of the road sat a car engulfed in flames, black smoke billowing into the sky. The heat radiated outward, a stark contrast to the chill of the evening. Mark's first instinct was to freeze, his mind racing to make sense of the chaos before him. But then movement inside the car caught his eye. Someone was trapped. Without a second thought, Mark sprang into action. His tired legs found new strength as he sprinted toward the burning vehicle, the acrid smell of smoke filling his lungs. As he neared the car, he could see a figure inside, a woman, struggling against the seatbelt that held her captive. Her movements were frantic, her face pale with terror. "Help! Somebody help!" Her muffled screams barely reached his ears over the roaring flames. Mark reached the driver's side door and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The heat was unbearable, searing his skin even through his jacket. He slammed his fist against the window, shouting, "Hold on! I'll get you out!" The woman turned her head, and Mark's heart sank. It was Judge Karen Blake. For a fleeting moment he hesitated. The same Judge Blake who had humiliated him countless times. The same woman who treated him like dirt under her shoes. But the fear in her eyes, the desperation in her movements, reminded Mark of something his father used to say, "Do what's right, even when it's hard." Mark pulled a small metal tool from his pocket, one he used to tighten loose screws on his janitorial cart. With a swift motion, he swung it against the window. The glass shattered, spraying shards everywhere. Ignoring the pain of a few stray cuts, he reached inside and unlocked the door. The heat intensified as he leaned into the car, fumbling with the seatbelt clasp. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The clasp finally gave way, and Mark grabbed Judge Blake under her arms, dragging her out of the car. She was limp and coughing, her breath ragged from inhaling smoke. Mark staggered backward, pulling her as far from the car as his strength allowed. Just as they reached the edge of the road, the car exploded in a deafening blast, sending a shockwave that knocked them both to the ground. For a moment, everything was silent except for the ringing in Mark's ears. He groaned, pushing himself up on shaky arms. Judge Blake lay a few feet away, her face streaked with soot, her hair singed at the edges. She was alive, but clearly in shock. Mark crawled toward her, his own body screaming in protest. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. He reached out a hand to help her sit up, expecting at least a word of gratitude. Instead, Judge Blake recoiled, her expression twisted with disdain. She slapped his hand away, glaring at him as though he were the source of her ordeal. "Don't touch me," she spat, her voice cold and cutting. "Just stay away." Mark blinked, stunned. "I just saved your life," he said, his tone laced with disbelief. She ignored him, brushing off her soot-covered clothes with shaking hands. "You shouldn't even be here," she muttered, as if his mere presence offended her. Before Mark could respond, the wail of approaching sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights bathed the street as police cars screeched to a halt. Officers poured out, their faces a mix of urgency and confusion. One of them rushed to Judge Blake's side, helping her to her feet. "What happened, ma'am?" the officer asked, his voice calm but firm. Judge Blake pointed a trembling finger at Mark, her eyes narrowing. "It was him," she said, her voice rising. "He tried to kill me. He trapped me in the car and set it on fire." Mark's jaw dropped. "What? That's not true." "I saved you," he protested, his voice filled with shock and anger. But Judge Blake wasn't listening. She clung to the officer's arm, her voice growing more hysterical. "Arrest him. He's dangerous." The officer hesitated, glancing between Mark and Judge Blake. Mark raised his hands, palms open, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the panic bubbling inside him. "I didn't do anything. I saw the car on fire, and I pulled her out. That's it." But the officer's face hardened. "Sir, we'll sort this out at the station," he said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Mark's heart pounded as two officers approached him, their hands gripping his arms. "You've got this all wrong," he said, struggling against their hold. "Check the car. Check the scene. I didn't do anything." The officers didn't listen. They forced Mark to the ground, his cheeks scraping against the rough asphalt. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists as they snapped into place. Around him, the chaos of the scene continued. Firefighters arrived, dousing the flaming wreckage, while paramedics tended to Judge Blake, who now sat on the curb, her face a mask of indignation. As Mark was hauled to his feet and shoved toward a waiting police car, he caught one last glimpse of Judge Blake. She didn't look at him with gratitude or even pity. Instead, her eyes were cold, her lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. The car door slammed shut, and Mark sat in stunned silence, his mind racing to process what had just happened. He had risked his life to save her. He had acted without hesitation, driven by nothing more than a sense of duty and humanity. And now, he was being treated like a criminal. As the police car pulled away, the burning wreckage of the car disappearing into the distance, Mark's thoughts were a whirlwind of disbelief and anger. How had things gone so wrong? How had doing the right thing led him here, handcuffed and accused of a crime he didn't commit? For the first time in his life, Mark felt the full weight of injustice pressing down on him. And he knew this was only the beginning. The police station was a whirlwind of chaos and noise as Mark Williams was dragged through its doors. The metallic jangle of his handcuffs echoed in his ears, sharp and grating, a cruel reminder of the injustice unfolding before him. His heart pounded in his chest, the panic rising like a tide he couldn't stop. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of disbelief pressing down on him as officers led him deeper into the station. It had all happened so fast. One moment, he was catching his breath on the side of the road, the fiery wreckage of the car behind him, and the next, Judge Karen Blake was pointing a trembling finger at him, her voice shrill with accusation. "He did this," she had shouted, her words slicing through the night. "He tried to kill me. Arrest him." Mark had frozen, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. His mind raced to make sense of the situation. Had she lost her mind? How could she twist the truth so easily, so cruelly? He had saved her life, pulled her from the clutches of death, and this was her response? "That's not true," Mark had yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "I saved her. The car was on fire, and I got her out." But the police had already made up their minds. They weren't listening to him. Their attention was fixed on the trembling judge, who clutched her arms and played the victim to perfection. Her disheveled appearance, soot-streaked face, and tear-filled eyes painted a picture of vulnerability. It didn't matter that her story made no sense. To them, she was Judge Blake, a respected figure of authority. And Mark, he was just a janitor. Now, as he was led to a holding cell, Mark's thoughts were a whirlwind of disbelief and anger. The officer gripping his arm shoved him forward, forcing him into the small, cold space. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the room like a final nail in the coffin. Mark sank onto the metal bench, his head in his hands. His wrists ached where the handcuffs had dug into his skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, searching for some clue, some explanation for how everything had gone so horribly wrong. He had acted on instinct, without hesitation, risking his life to save hers. The flames, the heat, the choking smoke, it all came rushing back to him. He could still feel the weight of her body as he dragged her to safety, still hear the deafening roar of the explosion as the car went up in flames. And yet, none of that seemed to matter now. His act of heroism had been twisted into a heinous crime, and he was powerless to fight back. Hours passed in suffocating silence. The cold air bit at his skin, and the hard bench offered no comfort. Mark's stomach growled with hunger, but no one brought him food or water. It was as if he had already been forgotten, left to rot in the cell while Judge Blake's lies continued to weave their web of deceit. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the stillness. Mark looked up as the door to the holding area creaked open, revealing 2 officers and a man in a suit. The suited man's expression was unreadable, his lips pressed into a thin line as he stepped inside. "Mark Williams," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Detective Alan Brooks. We're here to get your statement." Mark's throat was dry, his voice hoarse as he responded. "My statement? I've been trying to tell you from the start. I didn't do anything wrong. I saved her." Detective Brooks gestured for the officers to uncuff him. Mark winced as the cuffs were removed, rubbing his sore wrists. He glanced at the detective, searching for any sign of understanding or compassion, but Brooks' face remained stoic. "Let's start at the beginning," Brooks said, pulling out a notepad. "Tell me everything that happened tonight." Mark took a deep breath, steadying himself. He recounted the events as clearly and calmly as he could, describing how he had seen the burning car, rushed to help, and pulled Judge Blake from the wreckage. He explained how she had turned on him, accusing him of trying to kill her despite the obvious truth. When he finished, Brooks studied him for a long moment, his pen hovering over the notepad. "You expect me to believe that," he finally said, his tone laced with skepticism. Mark's frustration boiled over. "It's the truth," he said, his voice rising. "I don't care if you believe me or not. Check the scene. Talk to the firefighters, the paramedics. Someone must have seen what happened." Brooks raised an eyebrow. "And yet, Judge Blake claims you locked her in the car and set it on fire. Why would she lie about something like that?" Mark shook his head, exasperated. "I don't know. Maybe she hates me. Maybe she can't stand the idea of someone like me saving her. But I'm telling you, I didn't do anything wrong." The detective's expression didn't waver, and Mark's heart sank. He could see the doubt in Brooks' eyes, the unspoken judgment. The truth didn't matter here. All that mattered was Judge Blake's word against his, and in their eyes, her word was worth more. As the hours stretched on, Mark's despair deepened. He thought of his small apartment, the bills piling up on the kitchen counter, the life he had worked so hard to build. All of it was slipping away, stolen by a lie he couldn't fight. Meanwhile, outside the station, Judge Blake was already spinning her story. Reporters had flocked to the scene, their cameras capturing her tearful recounting of the events. She painted herself as a victim, a woman who had narrowly escaped death at the hands of a deranged janitor. Her words dripped with venom as she described Mark as a dangerous, unstable man who had targeted her out of jealousy or hatred. The headlines the next morning were brutal. "Respected judge survives attempted murder," one read. Another declared, "Hero judge thwarts deadly attack by courthouse employee." Mark's name was splashed across the news, his face plastered on every screen. He had become a villain overnight, his reputation destroyed by a woman who had everything to gain from his downfall. In the days that followed, Mark remained in his cell, his hope dwindling with each passing hour. He thought of the moment he had reached into the burning car, the adrenaline that had propelled him forward, the relief he had felt when he pulled Judge Blake to safety. And now, that moment of courage had been turned into a nightmare. As he sat in the cold, silent cell, Mark vowed to himself that he wouldn't give up. He didn't know how he would fight back or who would believe him, but he knew one thing for certain. The truth was on his side. And somehow, he would find a way to make it heard. The night was still, with only the faint hum of traffic echoing through the streets. Inside his cold, dimly lit cell, Mark Williams sat on the hard bench, his head resting against the concrete wall. His mind was a whirlwind of despair and disbelief, the weight of Judge Blake's false accusations crushing his spirit. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there or when he'd last eaten. Time had become meaningless in the suffocating confines of the cell. Unbeknownst to Mark, the world outside had begun to shift. In the chaos surrounding the burning car, a passerby had pulled out their phone, capturing the harrowing events as they unfolded. The shaky footage showed Mark running toward the flames, smashing the window and pulling Judge Blake to safety. It also captured her cold dismissal of his help, the arrival of the police, and the chilling moment she pointed at Mark, accusing him of attempting to kill her. The bystander, initially shocked by the scene, uploaded the video to social media later that night. Within hours, the footage began to spread like wildfire. The raw, unedited clip struck a nerve with viewers. The courage and selflessness Mark displayed contrasted starkly with the cruelty of the accusations leveled against him. The injustice was palpable, and people couldn't look away. By the next morning, the video had amassed millions of views. Comment sections were flooded with outrage, disbelief, and demands for action. "How could this happen?" one user wrote. "He saved her life, and this is how she repays him." Another commented, "This isn't just about Mark. This is about the system that allows people like Judge Blake to abuse their power." Soon, the hashtag Justice for Mark began trending globally. Influencers, activists, and even celebrities shared the video, amplifying the story's reach. News outlets picked up the footage, airing it alongside heated discussions about racial injustice and abuse of authority. The narrative had shifted. Mark was no longer just a janitor accused of a crime. He was now a symbol of systemic inequities that resonated with people across the world. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the police station where Mark was being held. People carried signs that read, "Free Mark Williams," "Stop the Lies," and "Justice for All." Chants filled the air, a collective voice demanding accountability and fairness. Among the protesters were community leaders, local activists, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by Mark's story. The protests grew larger by the hour, spilling into the streets around the courthouse. Traffic came to a halt as more people joined the demonstrations, their anger fueled by years of pent-up frustration over similar cases. For many, Mark's ordeal was a tipping point, a glaring example of how the system disproportionately failed black men and women. Inside the station, Mark remained unaware of the storm brewing outside. He sat in his cell, exhausted and defeated, still trying to piece together how his life had unraveled so quickly. The sound of chanting occasionally reached his ears, faint and muffled, but he dismissed it as a figment of his imagination. He couldn't fathom that people were fighting for him, that his name was on the lips of thousands. Meanwhile, journalists began digging into Judge Blake's past. Whispers of misconduct surfaced, painting a troubling picture of a woman who had wielded her authority with impunity. Old cases were re-examined and patterns of bias emerged. Former defendants and courthouse employees came forward, sharing stories of unjust rulings and mistreatment. The video's virality also caught the attention of civil rights organizations. Legal experts weighed in, condemning the police for their quick arrest of Mark without a proper investigation. "This isn't just an isolated incident," one prominent lawyer said during a televised interview. "This is a reflection of a deeply flawed system that prioritizes power and privilege over truth and justice." Later that afternoon, Mark was startled by the sound of his cell door opening. A man in a sharp suit stepped inside, his expression a mix of determination and empathy. "Mr. Williams, my name is James Carter," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm a lawyer with the Equal Justice Foundation. We've seen the video, and we're here to help." Mark hesitated, unsure if he could trust the sudden appearance of an ally. But something in Carter's tone, firm yet kind, gave him hope. "What video?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. Carter pulled out his phone and played the footage. Mark watched in silence as the events of that night unfolded on the small screen. Tears welled up in his eyes as he saw himself sprinting toward the flames, his every movement driven by a desperate need to save a life. But when the video showed Judge Blake's false accusations and his subsequent arrest, anger and sadness overwhelmed him. "They saw this?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "The whole world has seen it," Carter replied, "and they're on your side. There are protests outside the station right now, demanding your release. We're going to fight this, Mark. You're not alone anymore." As night fell, the protests showed no signs of slowing. The crowd outside the station swelled to thousands, their chants growing louder and more unified. "Justice for Mark! Justice for Mark!" they cried, their voices echoing through the city streets. Mark's story had struck a chord far beyond his local community. People across the nation began sharing their own experiences of injustice, using #JusticeForMark as a rallying cry. The movement became a beacon of hope for those who had long felt silenced and ignored. Inside the station, the atmosphere grew tense. Officers whispered among themselves, their unease palpable as the protests outside intensified. The police chief held an emergency meeting, aware that the growing public scrutiny could not be ignored. Calls from city officials, civil rights leaders, and even national politicians flooded his office, all demanding answers. By midnight, the decision was made. Mark would be released pending further investigation. The chief knew it wasn't an admission of guilt or innocence, but a necessary step to calm the escalating tensions. Carter informed Mark of the news, and for the first time in days, a flicker of hope appeared in his eyes. When Mark stepped out of the station, the sight that greeted him was overwhelming. Hundreds of people cheered, their voices rising in a wave of support. Camera flashes illuminated the night as reporters rushed to capture the moment. Mark stood still, his heart pounding, unsure how to react. Carter placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've got a lot of people behind you, Mark," he said. "This isn't just about clearing your name. It's about shining a light on the truth." Mark's voice wavered as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you," he said, his words barely audible over the cheering. "Thank you for believing in me." The crowd erupted into applause, their chants renewed with vigor. Mark had gone from being invisible to becoming the face of a movement. His story was no longer just his own. It was a call to action, a demand for accountability, and a testament to the power of truth. The clanging of keys jolted Mark Williams from his restless sleep. He sat up abruptly, the thin blanket sliding off his shoulders. The sound of the heavy cell door unlocking was an unfamiliar one. For 3 long days, he had been trapped in this small, cold space, his only companions the silence and the weight of despair. The air was thick with uncertainty as the officer swung the door open. "Williams," the officer said gruffly, not meeting his eyes. "You're being released." Mark blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Released?" he repeated, his voice hoarse from lack of use. The words felt foreign, almost too good to be true. The officer nodded, gesturing for Mark to step out. "Your lawyer's here. Let's go." Mark's legs felt weak as he stood, a combination of hunger, exhaustion, and disbelief coursing through him. He shuffled forward, his heart pounding in his chest. As he exited the cell, the hallway stretched before him like a lifeline, pulling him toward an uncertain but hopeful future. At the end of the corridor, a man in a crisp suit stood waiting. His presence was commanding yet kind, a beacon of calm amidst the chaos. "Mr. Williams," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm James Carter, your attorney. The Equal Justice Foundation is representing you. We're here to make sure you get the justice you deserve." Mark hesitated, staring at the outstretched hand before shaking it. The warmth of Carter's grip was grounding, a small reassurance in the sea of uncertainty. "I don't understand," Mark murmured. "Why now? Why are they letting me go?" Carter offered a reassuring smile. "The video of your rescue went viral, Mr. Williams. People saw the truth, the real truth. The public outcry has been overwhelming. Thousands are demanding your release and accountability for Judge Blake's actions. It's not over yet, but this is a step in the right direction." Mark's chest tightened as he absorbed the words. After days of isolation, of feeling abandoned and powerless, the idea that strangers had rallied behind him was almost too much to process. He nodded silently, his throat too constricted with emotion to speak. As Carter led him toward the station's exit, the muffled sound of voices grew louder. Mark frowned, glancing at his lawyer. "What's going on out there?" Carter's smile widened. "You'll see." The station door swung open, and Mark was hit with a wave of noise so powerful it made him stop in his tracks. Hundreds, no, thousands, of people stood gathered outside, their chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for Mark! Justice for Mark!" The sight was overwhelming. Signs waved in the air, bearing messages like "Free Mark Williams," "Truth Matters," and "End Systemic Injustice." Reporters stood with cameras, capturing every moment, while community leaders and activists addressed the crowd through megaphones. The sheer volume of support was staggering. Mark's legs threatened to buckle beneath him as tears welled up in his eyes. He had spent his life being invisible, overlooked, and dismissed. And now, these people, strangers who had never met him, were standing here for him, fighting for his freedom and dignity. "This is all for me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, Mark, this is for you. People believe in your innocence. They saw what really happened. You're not alone anymore." The crowd's energy was infectious, and as Mark stepped forward, the cheers grew louder. People reached out to shake his hand, pat his back, and offer words of encouragement. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt seen. Truly seen. A reporter pushed through the throng, microphone in hand. "Mr. Williams, how does it feel to be free?" she asked, her tone urgent but respectful. Mark hesitated. The words caught in his throat. He looked out at the sea of faces, each one filled with hope and determination. Finally, he found his voice. "It feels overwhelming," he said, his voice trembling. "I never thought anyone would believe me, but seeing all of you here, standing up for what's right, it gives me hope. Hope that the truth will come out. Hope that justice will be served." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers reverberating through the city streets. Mark wiped a tear from his cheek, humbled by the magnitude of the moment. Over the next few hours, Mark remained outside the station, speaking with supporters and listening to their stories. Many shared their own experiences of injustice, their voices trembling with emotion as they recounted moments of prejudice and discrimination. Others simply expressed their admiration for Mark's courage, calling him a hero for risking his life to save Judge Blake, despite her treatment of him. The solidarity was unlike anything Mark had ever experienced. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger. His case had become a symbol of the fight against systemic inequities, a rallying cry for those who had been silenced and overlooked for far too long. Later that evening, Mark found himself in a quiet corner of the station, sitting with Carter and a small team of advocates from the Equal Justice Foundation. They laid out the plan moving forward, clearing his name, holding Judge Blake accountable, and ensuring that his story continued to shine a light on the broader issues at hand. "This isn't just about proving your innocence," Carter explained. "It's about setting a precedent. People like Judge Blake need to know they can't abuse their power without consequences. And you, Mark, have the strength and the story to make that happen." Mark nodded, his resolve strengthening with each passing moment. The fear and helplessness that had consumed him over the past few days were beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did," he said firmly. "If my story can make a difference, then I'll do whatever it takes." As Mark left the station that night, the streets were quieter but still filled with supporters holding candles and singing softly. The warm glow of the flames lit up the night, a symbol of resilience and hope. Mark walked among them, shaking hands, hugging strangers, and thanking them for their unwavering belief in him. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, Mark felt ready to face it. He had been through the fire, literally and figuratively, and come out the other side. The truth was on his side, and now, so was the world. As he reached the edge of the crowd, Mark paused, looking back at the people who had fought for him. His voice, steady and strong, carried through the night. "Thank you," he said, "not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been silenced, ignored, or treated unfairly. Together, we can make sure this never happens again." The crowd cheered once more, their voices rising in unison. Mark smiled, a flicker of hope igniting within him. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. Mark Williams sat in James Carter's office, a small but cluttered room that felt alive with purpose. Files were stacked high on the desk, interspersed with coffee cups and legal briefs. The hum of activity outside the door was a constant reminder of how much work lay ahead. Despite the chaos, Carter exuded calm confidence, his focus entirely on the task at hand. "Mark, we're going to dig deep," Carter said, leaning forward. "Judge Blake's actions don't exist in a vacuum. If she's capable of this level of misconduct, there's a trail. We just have to find it." Mark nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Though the fear of speaking out lingered, it was overshadowed by his growing determination. The events of the past week had ignited something within him, a need not only to clear his name, but to ensure that no one else suffered at the hands of people like Judge Blake. The investigation began with whispers. Carter's team reached out to former defendants, courthouse staff, and attorneys who had worked under Judge Blake's watch. At first, the responses were cautious, hesitant. People fear retaliation or doubted that their voices would make a difference. But as the video of Mark's rescue continued to dominate headlines and social media, those whispers grew louder. One by one, stories began to surface. A black single mother recounted how Judge Blake had handed her an unusually harsh sentence for a minor traffic violation, leaving her unable to care for her children. A young Latino man described how his plea for leniency had been met with scorn, his punishment far exceeding the norm for his offense. A former courthouse clerk revealed how Blake would routinely belittle staff, particularly those from minority backgrounds, using her authority to demean and intimidate. Each story painted a damning picture of a judge who wielded her power not with fairness, but with prejudice. Carter's team compiled the accounts, corroborating them with court records and legal precedents. The evidence was mounting, and it was undeniable. Judge Karen Blake had a history of racially biased rulings and abuse of power. As the findings became public, the backlash was swift. News outlets published exposés detailing Blake's history, and public outrage reached a fever pitch. Calls for her resignation grew louder, with activists and legal experts demanding a full investigation into her past rulings. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse was a hive of activity. Protesters gathered outside, their signs and chants calling for justice. Reporters scrambled to secure spots in the courtroom, eager to capture what had become one of the most high-profile cases in recent memory. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Carter and his legal team. His heart pounded as he scanned the room. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he knew he wasn't alone. The support from the community and the tireless efforts of Carter's team had given him strength. Across the aisle sat Judge Blake, her once imposing demeanor now replaced with a veneer of defiance tinged with desperation. Her legal team whispered furiously, their faces betraying the cracks in their confidence. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and they knew it. When the judge presiding over the case called the court to order, the room fell silent. Carter rose to deliver his opening statement, his voice steady and commanding. "This case is about more than one man's unjust imprisonment," he began, gesturing toward Mark. "It is about a pattern of abuse, a betrayal of the very principles our justice system is meant to uphold." Judge Karen Blake used her position not to serve justice, but to perpetuate inequality and prejudice. "Today, we will prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt." When it was Mark's turn to testify, the courtroom held its breath. As he made his way to the witness stand, every step felt heavy with significance. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he sat down and faced the room. Carter approached him, his voice gentle. "Mark, can you tell the court what happened on the night of the fire?" Mark recounted the events with quiet determination, his voice unwavering despite the raw emotion behind his words. He described the burning car, the terror in Judge Blake's eyes as she struggled to escape, and his instinctive decision to save her despite everything. His voice caught briefly as he recounted her accusations and the moment he was thrown into a police car, but he pushed through, determined to be heard. "I risked my life to save hers," he said, his voice rising slightly. "And for that, I was treated like a criminal. But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been silenced, dismissed, or judged unfairly because of the color of their skin." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The courtroom was silent, the impact of his testimony palpable. Even those who had doubted him couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice, the weight of his experience. Outside the courthouse, the public hung on every update. News networks broadcast the trial live, and social media buzzed with reactions to each revelation. Mark's testimony became a rallying cry, his words sparking discussions about systemic racism and the urgent need for reform. As the trial continued, Carter called witness after witness to the stand. Former defendants, courthouse staff, and legal experts testified to Blake's misconduct, their accounts corroborating the evidence. The defense attempted to discredit them, but their efforts fell flat against the mountain of proof. After days of testimony and arguments, the moment of truth arrived. The courtroom was packed as the presiding judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Mark's hands clenched tightly together, his heart pounding in his chest. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the judge began. This court finds that Judge Karen Blake engaged in a pattern of misconduct that undermined the integrity of the justice system. She is hereby stripped of her position and will face further investigation into her actions. The room erupted into murmurs as the weight of the decision settled in. For Mark, it was a moment of vindication. The truth had finally prevailed. As Mark left the courthouse that day, he was greeted by a sea of supporters. Their cheers and applause were a stark contrast to the isolation he had felt just days earlier. He smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. But he knew this wasn't the end. "This is just the beginning," Carter said as they walked toward the crowd. "Your story has opened the door for change, Mark. Now it's up to all of us to keep pushing." Mark nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. His fight had exposed the cracks in the system, but there was still work to be done. As he addressed the crowd, his voice carried with it a message of hope and determination. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about building a system that works for everyone. Together, we can make that happen." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy a testament to the power of truth and community. Mark had begun his journey seeking justice for himself, but along the way, he had become a voice for many. And though the road ahead was long, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The air was thick with tension, every eye fixed on the bench. Mark Williams sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Beside him, James Carter offered a reassuring nod, his confidence unwavering. Across the room, Judge Karen Blake sat stiffly, her composure slipping under the weight of the evidence stacked against her. The judge overseeing the case, a stern but fair woman known for her integrity, cleared her throat and began to speak. After reviewing the testimony and evidence presented over the course of this trial, this court finds that Judge Karen Blake engaged in repeated acts of misconduct, including obstruction of justice and malicious prosecution. Her actions have undermined public trust in the judicial system and violated the ethical standards expected of her position. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to process the words. The judge continued, her tone resolute. "Effective immediately, Karen Blake is stripped of her position as a judge. Furthermore, a full investigation into her past rulings is ordered, with any cases found to be influenced by racial bias or misconduct to be reopened." The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Mark felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. Justice had been served. Judge Blake's downfall was swift and severe. As the media covered her conviction, more stories of her bias emerged. Former defendants, emboldened by the verdict, shared their experiences, painting a picture of a judge who had long abused her power. The legal community was shaken, and her case became a symbol of the urgent need for reform. Mark, once a man who had felt invisible, found himself at the center of a national conversation. His story resonated with people from all walks of life. News outlets clamored for interviews, and his face appeared on magazine covers. But for Mark, the victory wasn't about fame. It was about holding someone accountable and preventing others from suffering as he had. The verdict against Judge Blake ignited a firestorm of debate. Activists, politicians, and legal experts weighed in, discussing the implications of the case. Town halls and community meetings sprang up across the country, with people demanding transparency and fairness in the justice system. The hashtag Justice for All began trending, uniting voices in a call for systemic change. In a televised panel discussion, one legal analyst remarked, "Mark Williams' courage in standing up against Judge Blake has exposed a much larger issue. This isn't just about one bad judge. It's about a system that allowed her to thrive. We need comprehensive reform to ensure that justice is truly blind." Mark watched these discussions with a mixture of pride and humility. He had never intended to become a symbol for change, but he embraced the role, knowing the importance of the fight. Sitting in his modest apartment one evening, Mark reflected on how much his life had changed. The same walls that had once seemed oppressive now felt like a haven. He had fought not just for his own dignity, but for the countless others who had been silenced and ignored. He thought about the people who had supported him, the strangers who had protested outside the police station, the activists who had rallied behind his case, and the legal team that had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Their efforts had reminded him of the power of community and the strength that comes from standing together. The Equal Justice Foundation, inspired by Mark's case, invited him to join their team as an advocate for judicial reform. Though hesitant at first, Mark realized he could use his story to make a difference. He began traveling to schools, community centers, and legal forums, sharing his experience and calling for accountability in the justice system. "I'm not a lawyer," he often told audiences, "but I know what it feels like to be judged unfairly. And I know that we all have a role to play in making sure no one else has to feel that way." Mark's speeches were met with standing ovations. His quiet strength and unshakable resolve inspired people to take action, whether it was volunteering, voting for reform-minded officials, or simply treating others with more empathy and respect. The investigation into Judge Blake's rulings led to the reopening of dozens of cases. Some defendants saw their convictions overturned, while others received fairer sentences. For these individuals, Mark's fight was more than a victory. It was a lifeline. One such individual, a young man named Raphael, approached Mark after a community event. "You don't know me," Raphael said, his voice shaking, "but because of you, I'm free. Judge Blake's ruling ruined my life, but now I have a second chance. Thank you." Mark's eyes filled with tears as he shook Raphael's hand. In that moment, he understood the true scope of what had been achieved. Though Judge Blake's career was over, Mark knew the work was far from finished. The systemic issues that had allowed her to abuse her power were still in place, and real change would require sustained effort. He worked closely with Carter and the Equal Justice Foundation to push for legislation aimed at increasing judicial accountability and transparency. Mark's efforts caught the attention of lawmakers, and he was invited to testify before Congress. Standing in the hallowed halls of the Capitol, he spoke with the same quiet strength that had carried him through the trial. "This isn't about punishing one person," he said. "It's about creating a system that works for everyone. A system where justice isn't determined by the color of your skin or the size of your paycheck." His testimony was met with applause, and several members of Congress pledged to support reform efforts. For Mark, it was another step forward in a journey that had become about more than his own fight. It was about creating a better future for all. Months after the verdict, Mark stood on the steps of the courthouse where it had all begun. A crowd had gathered to celebrate the progress made in the wake of his case. Community leaders spoke about the importance of vigilance and perseverance, and Mark was invited to close the event. As he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. Mark looked out at the sea of faces. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds united by a shared commitment to justice. "This isn't just my victory," he said, his voice strong and steady. "It's ours. It's proof that when we stand together, we can make change happen. The fight isn't over, but today, we celebrate how far we've come. Thank you for believing in me, and thank you for believing in justice." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to the power of truth and perseverance. As Mark stepped away from the microphone, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Justice had been served, and the future was bright with possibility. Mark Williams stood in front of a packed auditorium, the warm light from the stage illuminating his calm yet resolute face. The room buzzed with anticipation as he adjusted the microphone, his story having brought together people from all walks of life. This was not where he had envisioned his journey would lead. But now, standing before a crowd eager to hear him speak, Mark felt a deep sense of purpose. "My name is Mark Williams," he began, his voice steady and confident, "and not long ago, I was just a janitor trying to get through each day. But life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it?" The audience chuckled softly. their eyes glued to the man who had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Mark continued, recounting the events that had changed his life forever. The burning car, his heroic rescue, the false accusations, and the eventual triumph of justice. Each word carried the weight of his struggle, but it also carried the hope he had found in the unwavering support of those who believed in him. In the months following the trial, Mark's life transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The quiet, unassuming janitor became a prominent advocate for justice, fairness, and equality. Organizations and institutions across the country invited him to share his story, his voice amplifying the call for systemic change. Mark's speeches weren't just about his own experiences. He spoke about the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, or unfairly judged. He shared stories of people who had reached out to him. A young woman who fought against workplace discrimination, a single father wrongfully accused of a crime, and a teenager inspired to pursue law after hearing his tale. "I'm not here because I'm special," Mark often said. "I'm here because I'm not. What happened to me could happen to anyone, but together, we can make sure it doesn't." Through his work with the Equal Justice Foundation, Mark became a bridge between communities and policymakers. He lobbied for reforms to hold judges and law enforcement accountable, ensuring transparency and fairness in their actions. His tireless efforts led to tangible change, including the establishment of an oversight committee to review judicial conduct. Mark's story continued to inspire people across the nation. Social media platforms were flooded with posts using the hashtag #MarkTheChange, a movement encouraging individuals to take a stand against injustice in their own lives and communities. Schools included his story in their curricula, teaching students the importance of courage, empathy, and resilience. One day, Mark received a letter from a young girl named Ava. Her words moved him deeply. "Dear Mr. Williams, I'm 12 years old, and my class learned about you in school. At first, I was sad about what happened to you, but then I saw how you didn't give up. You made things better for other people, and that makes you a hero to me. I want to be brave like you when I grow up." The letter became a reminder for Mark of why he continued to fight. It wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. A future where stories like his would no longer exist because the systems that enabled them had been dismantled. On a crisp autumn morning, Mark found himself walking through his old neighborhood. The familiar streets felt different now, not because they had changed, but because he had. Where he once walked with his head down, weighed by the burdens of daily life, he now walked with purpose. Neighbors greeted him warmly, their smiles genuine and their words encouraging. He passed the corner store where he had often bought his morning coffee, the park where he had spent quiet moments gathering his thoughts, and the small library where he had read books about heroes he never imagined he'd resemble. Each place held memories, and each memory reminded him of how far he'd come. Mark paused in front of a mural painted on the side of a building. It depicted him standing tall, surrounded by a diverse group of people holding signs that read truth, justice, and equality. The artist had captured the determination in his eyes, a reflection of the strength he hadn't known he possessed. A young boy approached him, tugging on his sleeve. "Mr. Williams," he said shyly, "is it true that you saved someone from a fire?" Mark crouched down to the boy's level, smiling warmly. "Yes, it's true. But you know what else is true? That we all have the power to help someone. You don't have to be a grown-up to make a difference." The boy's eyes lit up, and he nodded earnestly before running back to his friends. Mark stood, his heart full. Moments like these reminded him that his journey wasn't just about fighting injustice. It was about inspiring others to believe in their ability to create change. That evening, Mark attended a community event celebrating local heroes. He was the guest of honor, but he deflected the praise, choosing instead to highlight the collective effort that had led to his victory. "When I was at my lowest," he said, addressing the crowd, "I thought I was alone. But I wasn't. People I had never met stood up for me, believed in me, and fought for the truth. That's the power of community. That's the power of truth." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of those gathered. We live in a world where injustice thrives in silence. But when we speak out, when we stand together, we can break that silence. We can create a world where justice isn't a privilege, but a right. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing into the night. Mark felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his words had reached their hearts. As the event wound down, Mark sat on a bench, watching the stars twinkle above. Carter joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You've come a long way," Carter said, a hint of pride in his voice. Mark nodded, taking a sip of the warm drink. "And there's still a long way to go. But for the first time, I'm not afraid of the road ahead." Carter smiled. "That's because you know you're not walking it alone." Mark looked out at the city lights, a sense of peace washing over him. He thought about the man he had been before that fateful night, and the man he had become. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. As he rose to leave, Mark carried with him the knowledge that his story was far from over. It was a new beginning, not just for him, but for everyone who believed in the power of truth, justice, and the courage to stand against adversity.